Okay,
And I
welcome
click leave meeting.
everybody. We have a few more folks coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. So we have plenty of time for our program this morning. I am Lori Moore. I am a co-chair of the Oregon Reference Summit. And today the Oregon Reference Summit presents Researching a Family Legend, the intersection of legal research and genealogy. And I want to welcome our presenter, Lee Van Duzer.
Hi.
Take it away whenever you're ready, Lee.
All right. So my name is Lee Van Duzer. I'm the law librarian for Washington County, which is and our library is located in Hillsboro, Oregon. I've been here for 7 years now. Before that, I was the branch librarian at the U.S. District Court in San Jose, California for 6 years. And then I got my MLS at the University of Arizona and my Juris Doctor at Franklin Pierce Law Center, which is now the University of New Hampshire School of Law. So that's just a quick background about myself. So I'm going to start with just the kind of the history of the origin of this story. We have a partnership, or had a partnership, which I hope will resume here in the nearest future, with the Beaverton and Tigard City Libraries. And one evening each month, through 2019, at least, we would go into each of those libraries and provide legal research assistance. I see we have someone from Tigard. So it was a great way for us to reach out beyond Hillsboro and also extend our hours a little bit because it was in the evening. So it was an opportunity for us to reach people who after 5 o'clock, I think it was 3 to 7 were our hours on those locations. And so one evening when I was in Tigard, a woman came up to me and, I think it was maybe a fortuitous, she happened to be there and see that we were there. And she had a family kind of legend that she wanted to know more about. So I kind of, the passage of time, like I say, this would have been 2019. So I can't say for sure this is an exact quote of what she said, but basically, she was trying to find information on her relative who had sued the government and won, according to this family legend. And the context of it was he had an orchard that was flooded when the Grand Coulee Dam was built. So, and somebody was asking me before, is this kind of a step-by-step instructional lesson? And it's not really step-by-step. I mean, I'm going to go through my steps, but I think, any situation like this might have a different lead-in. And of course, one's background will kind of determine where one starts. So since I'm a law librarian, I, of course, started with the legal research side of things. There are some legal research databases that are very powerful and allow very specific searching. LexisNexis and Westlaw are the two big ones. We have access to both of those. Some of the tools there for just searching for a name, there's root expansion. So for the name Frederick Juan, you can get Fred or Frederick. And then, names, sometimes there's middle names, middle initials, sometimes there's not. They could be in a reverse order with the last name followed by the first name. So I usually use like within 3 words of. And so in these databases, then that'll get me, different variations of the name and kind of account for how it, somebody may have chosen to represent it in a legal document. And since this was a legal matter, of course, I was thinking about case law and looking through case decisions. There's also options within these databases. You can just do a general search. You can also do, they have a metadata fields. You can search for specific party, you can search within the party field. So is this a party to the case? You can search for attorney names. You can search for judges' names. So they're pretty robust, and I figured, this should be pretty straightforward. That said, I didn't have time to work with the patron right then, and so of course I got the patron's information and told her I'd get back to her after I got back to the office. So this would be a pretty short presentation if this slide had results. But I went into Lexis and I did my my name search and I got nothing. Now, one reason for this, and I don't remember how much she gave me about the date, but this was a slightly older case. And so one thing we'll see as I go through this is older cases, sometimes the metadata isn't there in the same way that it is for newer cases, but even in the case text, the information isn't necessarily present in the way we think of it now, or the way that it might be presented in cases if they were written today. Now, at the time, my library assistant, Paula Simon, well, I shouldn't say at the time, I mean, she's still interested in genealogy stuff. At the time, she was kind of really doing a lot of work looking at genealogy, particularly in her family. And when I was talking to her about this, she decided to dig into some genealogy resources she had access to. And I think the one that yielded results was newspapers.com, if I remember correctly. And she found some articles. And there were a few reasons these articles really were the breakthrough, as I say here on the slide, that allowed us to then start digging into this more deeply and actually finding information beyond just some paper articles. So I've highlighted on here the two pieces of information in this first newspaper article, which is actually about the original sale of the land in 1931. So prior to the building of the dam. It names Columbia Basin Orchards as the property or the business, which turned out to be critical, but then also has the name FW1, which was not something I had thought about. But at the time, it was not uncommon to simply use the first initials and then the last name. You see it again in the other article on the other side of the slide, and you'll see it with other names as well. There's a name down lower in this article, R.E. McIntyre. And I've seen this in other instances subsequently too, when looking at older cases. So these two things then gave me some more information to work with, as well as another article she found, and this started to get into the legal issues more. But I highlighted this section where there was also the name of a judge, Sam M. Driver. And as I said, some of these databases, I can try to pull up all of the cases that a specific judge has worked on. And then there was just a couple more articles that she found that kind of followed more the line of the case. As you'll see, these were actually, these articles do not represent the end of the matter, because these are 1947, and subsequently, we'll see I found some stuff from 1950 and 1955. But this gave me more information to then go back into the legal research databases and, as I said, start finding some things instead of getting zero results. That said, I'm going to start with another example of zero results. And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where older cases don't have the same robust features sometimes that we find now. So I looked for the judge, Sam Driver, and I actually didn't find anything. But again, we were seeing, the date range here was late 1940s, early 1950s. So it's not as surprising as if I did the same search now with the modern judge and modern cases. I would just be able to pull up a list of all of the cases that a judge had worked on. So then I tried Columbia Basin Orchards. And this is what turned out to be the turning point in the legal research. So you see, we found actually two cases with that in the title, Columbia Basin Orchard versus United States. And another feature you can use in Lexis and Westlaw is you can narrow the timeline. So like, I don't care about anything more recent. I'm really looking for, 1950-ish, since that was the date range in question. And I just want to highlight, there are other tools out there for finding cases. Some of them aren't as robust as Lexis and Westlaw, but they're still, they're free in the case of Google Scholar. So if you're not familiar with Google Scholar, it does have a case law research feature. And then you can even narrow down further. So you can say federal courts, state courts, in this case, it has Oregon as an option since it knows I'm from Oregon because Google knows all. But you can pick any other state. And they do have, there are some limitations in the scope of what they have, but for most matters, they do have enough to go through and find cases. And you can see it, they did have this case as well. And you can't do the same, necessarily specific searching that you can do in Lexis and Westlaw, but there's still a lot you can do with Google, and they do have advanced search features that allow you to narrow your results more if you need to do that. So one thing that stuck out at me, though, and you see I've got a red box here, that these cases were from the Court of Claims. Now, anyone who is kind of a legal geek, might pick up that this is not a citation you see often. I mean, when we hear about federal cases, we've all heard about the Ninth Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals, the district courts, when there's a trial at the district court in Oregon or something like that. Those are where you tend to see cases in the news. Court of Claims is a little less common. And part of that is because it has a very narrow jurisdiction. But that jurisdiction turned out to be key in this case, because one of the things they have jurisdiction over is claims for just compensation for the taking of private property. And essentially the core of this claim, if the government built a dam and that flooded an area that deprived somebody of land, that would be a taking, a federal government taking of that person's land. And here, for anyone who's not familiar with the structure of the US federal court system, this is a quick kind of illustration of the hierarchy. And so you have the district courts, and each state has at least one district court. And that's the trial level courts at the federal level. But then you also have the US Court of International Trade and the US Court of Federal Claims. Above that, then you have the US Court of Appeals. So we've heard of the Ninth Circuit, which Oregon is in. And the Ninth Circuit is comprised of Alaska, Hawaii, Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Nevada, Montana, and Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. And so any trial court appeal from those state federal courts gets heard at the US Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. For the most part, again, there's some exceptions. Some of those might go to the US Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is located in Washington, DC. And here's largely intellectual property claims amongst some others. So it was interesting then that this case was in this United States Court of Claims at the time, now the United States Court of Federal Claims, as it's been renamed over time. So another thing I decided to do, and this both illustrates the search I did with the new version of the name that I had, FW1, and another resource for case law research. So I'd found a couple of cases with Columbia Basin Orchard, and it made sense that those actually didn't include the name of Mr. Wan, because the Columbia Basin Orchard was really the primary entity in that case. Who owned it wasn't necessarily going to be listed in the case decisions or the documents. But I was curious to see if there are any other cases that come up with him as a party, and I did find a few. None of them necessarily were specific on this issue, but it was just interesting to find other cases that involve that individual. So FastCase is another database, and this most of you should have access to through the State of Oregon Law Library. It's not quite as robust as Lexis and Westlaw, but it's more specific than, say, Google Scholar. The main limitation here is because of the state law library's subscription, the content is limited to, I think, the states within the Ninth Circuit. So if you were looking for a case in South Carolina, then you probably wouldn't be able to pull it up in FastCase with that subscription. But this is a great resource. Otherwise, for doing case law research here in Oregon, or within the states of the Ninth Circuit, or statutory research or regulations. And so you can get to that. And I've got, I think, yeah, you can get to that through the State of Oregon Law Library. They have patron database access, and then FastCase linked right there. You have to sign up and get your own user ID, but it's pretty straightforward. And if you have any questions about using that, you're welcome to reach out to your local county law librarian, who will be happy to help you learn more about that resource or any of the others out there. And your local county law library may have Lexis and Westlaw. So now I'm going to move into the meat of what I found. So this was the most recent case then from 1955, Columbia Basin Orchard versus the United States. And two things stuck out at me when I looked at this case. First, from the synopsis, and I circled petition dismissed. So unfortunately, this told me that at least as far as this family legend, that Mr. Wan had fought against the government and won, that may not be correct. It looks like, unfortunately, the court dismissed the claim in this particular case. But the other thing that was interesting was when I looked at the opinion, because the synopsis is just a summary, but that does tell you what the final holding was. But in the actual opinion, in the first paragraph, there's a discussion that says, we dismissed plaintiff's petition on the ground that their right of action was barred by the statute of limitations. Thereafter, Congress passed an act conferring jurisdiction on us to hear plaintiff's claim notwithstanding the lapse of time. Now, this is unusual. It's not often that you see a case where there was a law giving petitioner specific exception to statute of limitations and the ability to have their case heard. But it has the citation for that, 68 Stat Part 2 A53. So that gets us into legislative history. Another direction to go with this. And so just a quick explanation of the US statutes at large for anyone who's not familiar with them or with the kind of federal legislative process. When Congress passes a law and the president signs it, those laws are then compiled chronologically in the US statutes at large. And those are available through various means, digital or in print, going back to the founding of our country. Those then get compiled by subject into the US code, which is what more of us are familiar with. In this case, this particular law wasn't in the US code, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But one resource we have access to where we can find US statutes at large is Hein Online. And thanks to our partnership with the Washington County Cooperative Library Services and the generosity of Hein Online, anyone with a WCCLS library card can access this resource. So when I went into US statutes at large, and since I have a citation, it's pretty easy to go into the citation navigator and plug in the specific information, 68 Stat 53. I did want to call out the LibGuide link here, because if you are using Hein Online, they're really good at having LibGuides that discuss the content and how to research within each of their databases. So when you see that little LibGuide link, you can click on that and get a wealth of information about how to use the resources at hand. Now, when I did that, then I pulled this up. There was an intermediate step that I didn't really highlight. It turns out, because if you remember, the original citation was 68 Stat A53. And in the form, I tried A53 and it said, no, you can't do that. When I tried 53, then it said, well, there are 3 different 68 Stat 53s. So there was one that's, 53, A53 and B53. So the second one turned out to be the correct one in this case. So here we have the actual law that was passed by Congress. And you'll see up here on the left, it says private law 370. And so that's another important distinction. In federal and in state laws, you have public laws and private laws. And public laws are what most of us are familiar with. Those are the laws that affect everyone. They get codified in the US code. Private laws typically only affect like an individual or a small group of individuals, a family, and a private company, something like that. So like in this case, it's taking this particular entity, Columbia Basin Orchards, and saying they get to have their case heard by the court, even though the statute of limitations has passed. And I forgot to clarify earlier, just in case anyone's not familiar with it, statutes of limitations broadly limit the amount of time you have to bring an action in court after you know or should have known of the incident in question. And usually it's just to help, if you wait too long to bring a claim, it can be harder to find evidence. It can be harder for the other party to defend themselves. So for a variety of reasons, it's just we typically, although there are exceptions, the legal system has limitations that vary as to how long you have to bring a claim. Now, this did have its own limitation in it. You see I highlighted at the bottom, they still had to bring the claim within 1 year after the date this act was enacted. But since they had presumably put a lot of effort into getting this act passed, obviously that would be sufficient at this point. Also, you'll notice, of course, it says nothing contained in this act shall be construed as an inference of liability. So they're saying, well, we're going to let you have your claim heard. We're not taking a stance on whether or not your claim is valid or should be granted. So. And then just another resource for finding the historic laws like this. And again, this is congress.gov. And so your mileage may vary depending on what year you're going back to. Their basic search here for legislation text goes back to 1952, which was perfect in this case because that's exactly what we're looking for. Another way that you can find a statute, depending on what citation information you have, and I forgot to, let's see, if I go back to the previous slide, you'll see up here on the top right, it says HR 2033. So the source of this act was House Resolution 2033, which then subsequently became Private Law 370. So when a bill is introduced, it's introduced in the House or the Senate, and it's introduced as a resolution or a bill, and then that's assigned its own number. So if you go into congress.gov, you could use the statutory citation, the 98 Stat A53, or you could use the HR 2033 citation and pull it up that way. So I thought, did I not? Okay. And I have a link in the handouts that links you to the congress.gov version of the statute as well. And I have the statutory text here. I think later, I thought it was. Oh, no, I showed you. Sorry, my brain is fried. Showed you the statutory text. So I was also curious to see, though, using Hein Online, if there was anything else that's cited to this statute, just out of curiosity. So I went back into Hein Online and I used the citation itself as a search term. So so this wasn't designed to bring up the document so much as other things that we're citing to it, that we're saying, oh, hey, we're going to refer to this statute. It was kind of a long shot. It's a private law. There's probably not going to be much out there besides the cases in question, but I was curious. And I did find this kind of the second item on here, federal reclamation laws annotated. So this was a compilation of public statutes related to reclamation. And when I looked at that, there wasn't much else there. It had the text of the statute again repeated, but there was the explanatory note, and that had some more information that turned out to be useful. It has the legislative history and refers to, again, you see that HR 2033 number, House Resolution, Private Law 370, but then you also see HR Report number 32 and Senate Report number 1253. So these are references to reports. So when a bill goes through Congress, there's hearings in the House and Senate and committees, and those can generate reports then, which provide information on kind of the background or why they think the bill should be passed or information like that. So I was like, oh, so this could be interesting to see. So I went back to Hein Online, and these reports, one resource for them is the Congressional Serial Set, which is available on Hein Online again. There is also some access to the US serial sets through congress.gov. There's some spottiness as to what's available and what's not through them or through Hein Online. Unfortunately, it's a lot of historic information to be digitized. But a lot of it is online through these resources. So I was able to, again, use the citation lookup tool since I had the House report number. So I was able to say House reports from the 83rd Congress, report number 32. And so I'm not showing you the full report. It was actually multiple pages. It is in the handouts. But one of the things that stood out, again, it said attached here to and made part of this report is a letter from the Department of Interior submitted in connection with an identical bill in the 82nd Congress. Wait, so this wasn't just introduced in the 83rd Congress when it passed, it was introduced earlier than that. So that was interesting. And actually that report is also included in the handouts when I found it. So ultimately there were two reports from the 83rd Congress, first session and second session. So again, every 2 years we have a congressional election. Every member of the House is up for re-election, and about 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So there's a new Congress every 2 years, and then they break their congressional sessions down into 2 sessions within each year is 1 session. So that's, you'll see 83rd, 82nd Congress, again, first session, second session. So we have those 2 reports, but then I also found these 2 journal entries. So there wasn't any real content here other than just this bill was introduced in both sessions of the 82nd Congress. So really this bill was first introduced in 1951. It didn't pass until 1954. And actually, if you look back at the cases, that makes sense because 1950 was when the original case was dismissed because the statute of limitations had run. And there could be a lot of reasons why it didn't pass first, but eventually did pass after 4 years. I mean, something like this would have been a relatively minor issue for most members of Congress. So it's not that it would have been controversial necessarily, but it just was maybe too small to get included in anything that finally passed. Now, this slide I call hindsight because when I was working on this presentation, it occurred to me that I had never, in the original iteration working on this, dug farther and found who was the House member who introduced this bill. Clearly, there must have been some connection, although it could have been, multiple degrees of separation between the Juan family and the representative. Somebody had to help them get, FaceTime with their representative to get them, aware of their issue and actually get them interested enough to help introduce this bill to give them the ability to have their case heard. So I did find a journal from 1951, the House entry that listed Mr. Holmes as the one who introduced the bill. And then in the congressional directory, I was able to find the representatives listed for the state of Washington, and it included Hal Holmes and had a little bit of biographical information. So that was just interesting to see and kind of, come full circle in finding who actually had introduced this bill. And a part of me wishes I had been able to, give that to the person, whether they would have been able to know if there was any family connection, after this much time had passed, I don't know, but it could have been interesting for them to have that extra information. But that, unfortunately, none of us are perfect. So sometimes it's always possible to go back and find, oh, I could have done a little more. So what happened? Well, I've got the original question again here. The person was trying to find information on the relative who sued the government and won. So of course, I sent an email to the patron. I included the cases that we'd found, the statute, the legislative history, including the House and Senate reports, the newspaper articles, and then of course a short summary of what all this meant and kind of where this had come from. And I also included here, out of just my own curiosity after working on this, I was like, what is the Grand Coulee Dam? So I actually found a picture of it. I'm like, oh, that's what the Grand Coulee Dam looks like. So now, this isn't the only question I've had where somebody actually came up to us, and I think both of these questions originated from Tigard or Beaverton, where somebody had some family, legend about a lawsuit. This one was a little different. They had a relative who was involved in a lawsuit against the guy who founded Girard, California, which is now Woodland Hills. The person's name was Victor Girard, and it had been a big scandal because Victor Girard really didn't build a city. He put up a facade of a city and convinced people to buy land. And so there's a link here to this article about scandals of the 1920s when this happened. But here the short answer was no, I wasn't really able to find any information. The relative in this case was a lawyer who had been supposedly involved in this lawsuit against Victor Girard. And I was able to find confirmation that the person was a lawyer. They were listed in the California directory of attorneys, but I wasn't able to find any cases involving the, I may have found one case involving the attorney, but it had absolutely nothing to do with this. But no other cases involving that attorney. And that really highlights one of the limitations when it comes to the world of legal information, or a couple of limitations. Part of that is the difference between state courts and federal courts. In federal courts, there are reporters of decisions from the trial court level, decisions at the appellate level, and of course, decisions at the Supreme Court level. In states, there are no real compilations of state trial court decisions. And in this case, it looks like that's probably where this was. I mean, this would have been a fraud claim by a variety of people against this person. And those claims would have been filed in the state courts. Because this person didn't have a lot of money, there wouldn't have been any value in people appealing whatever decisions had. So that's probably why I wasn't finding any appellate level cases in California having to do with this case. And then also the attorney, the family member who was an attorney, a lot of attorneys never go in front of a court. So it's not at all surprising to take an attorney name, plug it into even a modern database and find no cases involving that attorney, because a lot of attorneys deal with transactional law, contracts, wills and estates, things like that, where they're not going to be necessarily filing anything in the courthouses. So that limitation, plus the fact that, again, even now, state trial court cases are very difficult to try to search. Some of the big databases like Lexis and Westlaw now have some docket information for trial court cases, so you can sometimes find some of those, but even those tend not to be exhaustive. It's kind of hit or miss as to what cases are included in that. And there's not as much information there because trial court cases are often just a quick decision from the judge from the bench, or a trial verdict, a jury verdict from a trial. They're not the meaty decisions that you see typically in the appellate levels, where you have pages of the court's writing, the history of the case, and then the legal justification for their decision. But it shows you that sometimes there's not going to be much out there, even when it comes to the legal side of things. So it really depends on what level we're dealing with. And I have some links here. The Washington County Cooperative Library Services has a page on law and government. And the main reason I put that on here is, again, we have access to Hein Online, and anyone with a WCCLS library card can access the same resource through that page. And they have some other things linked to there that can be helpful. A link to congress.gov, specifically to the House resolution that was relevant in this case. A link to scholar.google.com for anyone who's not familiar with it. And then the Law Library of Congress actually has quite a number of research guides and webinars. So when you're dealing with federal questions, and they also touch on international law if you're ever dealing with that or interested in that. They have some very helpful research guides and webinars which get into how to research federal legislative history, federal statutes, federal case law. And then they do have one that I called out specifically on how to conduct research in the US serial set online. So if that's a tool you're interested in learning more about or digging into more deeply, that video could be helpful in understanding that resource. And then a couple of other things, the Directory of Oregon County Law Libraries. Like I said, your local county law librarian will be more than happy to help you learn more about some of these resources and the legal tools that are available, and might have access to Lexis or Westlaw, amongst other databases. And then the State of Oregon Law Library. Again, they provide access to FastCase to any Oregon resident. And they also provide access to NOLA books online for any Oregon resident. The interface for that changed recently. It's a little more tricky to sign up for, but still that can be a great resource for somebody who has trouble getting into the library, but still wants to use some NOLA resources. And then a link to the handouts. If you have this handout, you probably have the link to the handouts, but I figured I should include it just in case somebody's getting it some other way. So that is my presentation. And now there's an opportunity for any questions that you have. And I see one about the Victor Gerard case. Could the trial documents be available at the actual courthouse? Don't the courts have to keep trial records? So as with any good legal answer, the answer it depends. And actually, I don't believe they have to keep trial records permanently. Every state's different as to how long they have to keep records for. And again, there's a difference between the state and the federal level. So when I was with the federal court, the physical records that the court had, after 10 years, they would send to the National Archives and Records Administration. Since we were in San Jose, I think there was a repository in the Bay Area that they went to. But somewhere like here, it might be up in Seattle. So at the federal level, then, yeah, any print records you would have to go to the NARA offices and try to access those. And I don't know if there's any timeline after which they discard those records. At the state level, each state's going to vary as to how long they require those records to be kept. My guess is it's not permanent, that there is some sort of time frame after which they can destroy them. And unfortunately, a lot of them probably are no longer in existence. But that would kind of to circle back to, the online availability of things. In a lot of cases, that might be your only recourse to try, is to go to the trial court and see if they have those records still in hard copy, because they very likely are not digitized, even if they do have them in print.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, from what I'm hearing, when I'll say the Juan case,
Mm-hmm.
their question was they had a relative that won.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I'm hearing and what I read, they didn't win, but it was remarkable because a bill was introduced due to statute of limitation.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how do you flesh out questions? How do you communicate with the person that's asking you the question pertinent information, because they won, but they didn't win. Mm-hmm. And so how do you just do a lot of research without kind of narrowing down the question?
So, I mean, in this case, that's pretty much what I did. Is I had enough information to just start going out there and seeing what's available. And I felt in this case, I think every situation can be a little different. In this case, I didn't feel like I was getting so much that I had to narrow things down. I felt like I was lucky to find what I did find, which were, a few cases, the statute, and some legislative history. If it had been different, if I had felt like I was overwhelmed by the amount of information, like I can't tell which of these, I had the patron's email address, so I certainly could have emailed them and said, hey, here's what I'm finding. Do you have anything else now that I can give you this information? Do you have anything else you can share with me that might clarify where we're going? But I think that's really just going to be a case by case kind of question, and dependent on what resources are yielding results or not yielding results, as the case may be. Is that helpful at all?
Yes, very helpful.
Questions for Lee before we wind up? Okay, well, thank you, Lee. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I do want to plug our next Oregon Reference Summit virtual event. That'll be in October. We'll be talking about non-traditional reference and readers advisory. That'll be October 12th at 1 p.m. We'll send out registration information soon, but get that on your calendars. And also, we are planning on having an in-person event again next year. So more information about that to come also. But if you have ideas or input about that, feel free to connect with us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank you all.